Al-Qaeda leader Ayman al-Zawahiri has been killed in a drone strike in the Afghan capital, Kabul. US President Joe Biden made the announcement a short time ago. Al-Zawahiri allegedly carried out a key role in planning the 9/11 terrorist attacks against the US, alongside Osama bin Laden. Now, this comes a year after US forces pulled out of Afghanistan. Here's US President Joe Biden speaking earlier.
Our intelligence community located Zawahiri earlier this year. He had moved to downtown Kabul to reunite with members of his immediate family. After carefully considering the clear and convincing evidence of his location, I authorized a precision strike that would remove him from the battlefield once and for all. This mission was carefully planned, rigorously minimized the risk of harm to other civilians. And 1 week ago, after being advised that the conditions were optimal, I gave the final approval to go get him. And the mission was a success. None of his family members were hurt, and there were no civilian casualties.
Well, the Taliban has responded on Twitter in the last few hours, saying the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan strongly condemns this attack on any pretext and calls it a clear violation of international principles and the Doha Agreement. Well, for more on this, I'm joined by Roger Shanahan. He is a Middle East security expert at the Lowy Institute in Sydney, Australia. It's good to have you with us here on DW News. Firstly, what is your reaction to the US strike and how the Taliban has responded?
Yeah, so it's very interesting. I think of all this, we know that Washington has been looking to target Al-Qaeda. The most interesting thing about this, I think, is the fact that he was found and killed in downtown Kabul, which is not very good news for the Taliban, because it was assumed that he was somewhere in the hinterland. But the fact that he was able to live in the middle of Kabul is of concern for future security issues in Afghanistan.
And you served in Afghanistan with the Australian military. How surprised were you to find out that he was located in Kabul?
Yeah, listen, I think that was, not only in Kabul, but from what we know, a well-to-do residential area in Kabul. You can't have been there without the knowledge and the imprimatur of the Taliban themselves, which would be, a highly risky venture, you would have thought, on the part of the Taliban. The US got intelligence earlier in the year and waited until the conditions were optimum to do that. But personally, and I think most people who are looking at this issue find it quite disturbing that he was killed in downtown Kabul.
And how much of a blow is this for Al-Qaeda and obviously potentially other armed groups operating in Afghanistan?
Well, it probably shows you, there's probably two issues surrounding this. First of all, it just shows you that the US has been had him on the target list for the best part of 2 decades, and it finally comes to pass that they got the person that they were targeting. So it just shows you that even in democracies with changes of administrations in the US, patience is still a feature of the counterterrorism landscape. I think the other issue is organisations like Islamic State, like Al-Qaeda, they understand that the leadership is a high priority target for Washington, and so there will be a succession plan that has been put in place well before this in the case that the emir was killed. It'll take some time for that to become public, I assume, but those are probably the two issues. We shouldn't assume that this will upset Al-Qaeda's operational rhythm too much, but at the same time it sends a pretty clear message to all those kind of terrorist groups that Washington, if it takes 20 years, it takes 20 years before they'll target the leadership.
So are we likely to see more drone strikes in Afghanistan despite the Taliban voicing against it?
Well, I think there'll be a judicious use of drone strikes. The Doha Accords really do give the US the ability to do that against Islamic State targets. The US says that the Taliban broached it in terms of Al-Qaeda targets. So I think if there is a similarly high-value target, Al-Qaeda target in Afghanistan, we'll see that in the future. There will certainly be those against Islamic State targets when they have the opportunity. So this probably won't be the last, but against Al-Qaeda targets, probably used more judiciously, I would argue.
Roger Shanahan at the Lowy Institute in Sydney, thank you very much for your time.
My pleasure.
Well, let's get more on this and speak to DW's Sumi Somaskanda in Washington, D.C. So, Sumi, you've been listening to that press conference, and clearly a very important moment for U.S. President Joe Biden. Just talk us through the details of the strike.
Yeah, Rahila, this really is a pretty big deal for President Biden and his administration. So we know that the strike took place in Kabul over the weekend. We know that al-Zawahiri was on his balcony when he was killed, and we have learned from the AP news agency that he was in the house that he was in when he was killed, rather, was owned by a top aide to a senior Taliban leader. We learned also that this was the product of 6 months of planning, highly secretive planning by President Biden and a tight circle of his senior advisors, rather. None of this information had leaked out beyond that circle, and they had sources on the ground who were monitoring. Now, they didn't say what kind of aerial drone was used in the strike, but this was a CIA operation, and apparently U.S. security officials here mapping out the whole compound, even making a model of the compound to be able to assess the area in this house in Kabul. They were waiting since July, and U.S. security officials were able to establish a pattern, including when Zawahiri would emerge onto his balcony for longer periods of time. So they were able, actually, Rahila, to zoom in on the moment that he was alone on his balcony, which is pretty remarkable. We don't know of any U.S. personnel on the ground so far at this moment, but we are waiting for more details of that coming to trickle out, rather, in the next few days. They also conducted a legal analysis of the situation and came to the conclusion that he still posed a serious risk. And we heard President Biden there mentioning the number of attacks linked to this Al-Qaeda leader. So this is news that certainly for President Biden is being seen as a big success, and indeed that's what the White House is calling it.
What's been the reaction to this in the United States?
Yeah, we've seen a rare show of support from Republicans joining Democrats in praising President Biden and his administration. I want to tell you what one leading Republican, Senator Lindsey Graham, said. He said, quote, "Congratulations to the Biden administration and all those brave Americans involved in this successful counterterrorism operation." He went on to say that this is a significant event in the war on terror and delivers the message that America never forgets. And another Republican who's been very critical of President Biden, Senator Ted Cruz from Texas, saying all Americans will breathe easier knowing that Ayman al-Zawahiri, the leader of Al-Qaeda, has been eliminated. Now, there has been some criticism from Republicans, particularly on the right end of the party spectrum, saying that this is President Biden taking a victory lap unnecessarily, but mostly, Rahila, the voices here in the U.S. very supportive of the president and this counterterrorism operation.
And Sumi, all of this comes 1 year after the United States pulled out of Afghanistan. What does this tell us about how involved the U.S. is when it comes to Afghan sovereign soil?
Yeah, it is a really interesting question. And, you know, I think we have to listen to what President Joe Biden said in his address on Monday, that the killing of this leader brings one more measure of closure to families of the victims of September 11th. And he went on to say that the U.S. will not allow Afghanistan to become a terrorist safe haven, saying we are going to, quote, make sure nothing else happens. And it's interesting that this is being seen as a significant counterterrorism operation just 11 months, as you mentioned, after American troops left the country. The reality is that we know that a year after the fall of Kabul, that was widely considered to be very poorly handled by the Biden administration. And there were fears that this very messy exit by the U.S. and its allies gave Al-Qaeda the opportunity to rebuild. U.S. military officials have warned that this group has been trying to rebuild in Afghanistan. So I think what it tells us is that the U.S. might have pulled out of Afghanistan a year ago, but that is still very closely watching security developments on the ground there.
Sumi Somaskanda in Washington, D.C. Thank you.